And good evening. It's June 7th, 2024. Welcome to one of our Branches on the Vine with the Bible Project and the Sermon on the Mount series. So my brother, Jim Wern, and I, we decided to take a peek at these videos and have a chat about them as well, okay? So on the week that we normally release our videos, we're going to do it in 2 episodes. First, usually on a Thursday, we'll cover my comments and thoughts on the ideas that Tim and John and those wonderful folks at the Bible Project have put together for us. On the day after, usually on Friday, I'm going to have a discussion with my amazing brother Jim Wern, and we're going to bounce around those ideas and thoughts that we kind of pop up. So welcome this evening to our discussion of Episode 5, Sermon on the Mount. Don't make oaths, turn the other cheek, love your enemies. But why? And this is our part 3 on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kind of podcasts useful, then click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way the YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So this sermon, again, is found in Matthew 5 through 7. And for me, this is the seminal moment in the teachings of Jesus, because this is his longest, deepest, widest teaching that we have recorded in all of Scripture. And it covers things that we, for sure, we'd like to talk about, but deep down inside, we really have challenges walking out in our daily lives. So the Sermon on the Mount, Episode 5, don't make oaths, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, but why? This is our Part 3. There you go.
Hey, bro.
Yeah. So we've covered the first 2 on this, and we're ready to segue into episode our third one. But love your enemies.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier a little bit about this is an uncomfortable one that you don't hear talked about in church, and when it is with smaller groups, just entertaining the thought. It's defense mechanisms all around. And it begins with turning the other cheek. It kind of segues from there and drifts into the love your enemies part. So, what are some thoughts that you've had?
It's funny, the last couple of times that we've connected, and in your little intro, you say this is, one of the hardest ones. I kept thinking, yeah. And today I was going over it going, yeah, this is the hardest one of the 3. Mm-hmm. It really hit me deep because, like you said, I think it's mentioned in sermons, in teachings, but we typically talk about it almost more at a distance, like love your enemies over there,
Arm's
kind of
reach.
thing.
Yeah.
Right. We're not intimately connected with them. And we're quick to define who those enemies are. And those are the groups that we can safely say, oh, we love them. They're just, people outside the church. We love them. But we don't live in a country that is as overly oppressive as we see happening in the Middle East, in Asia. Mm-hmm. And yes, there is oppression that goes on here. There's ethnic issues that do exist, but not to the degree that they do in other places. True. So to put that in practice, it feels a little different. I was already starting to think, and I think there's some validity to this. Jesus is talking about personal responses. He's not talking about corporate or government or, larger entity kinds of things in terms of what our responses should do to things. And I kept going over that in my head, and I thought, I'm not fully convinced that that's true, because God's economy is different. Um, but he's addressing personal.
Right.
And so that's where we need to take it. It's kind of like the
Right.
parables. We tend to, like the parable of the talents, we tend to want to take that into finances and say, hey, here's, the way we should deal with finance. Jesus was not talking about finances.
No.
He was talking about the kingdom of God. So we have to be careful not to take these and draw parallels
Yeah.
in areas that Jesus is not addressing.
Right. Fair.
But when it comes to the personal
Right.
and how we respond, that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
And when somebody says to us, you have to do this, and we don't want to do it, or it feels like this is an oppressive act, how are we going to respond?
Yeah.
And as I listened to them and as they showed the example, and I loved the words they used were, when somebody does that to us, we can turn around and bless them. And then Jesus goes on to talk about what that kind of blessing looks like. God does indiscriminate blessing. I love that term. And so why can't we do the same? And
Yeah.
we have to do the same if, and as they both stated, creative love is the only pathway to real peace.
Yeah.
And so creative love says, I'm going to think outside the box, and I'm not going to do what is expected.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do what's unexpected.
Yeah.
And that is the key.
Yeah. It draws a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And here's one of those balancing points that we have an expectation of God. In other words, there'll be people that will say, when we're talking about people and in getting them involved in church. I want to be careful how I word this. And so we're like, you're broken, unloved, and the church loves you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and I agree, and they should, right? So that point that we're slowly sneaking into addressing is really the point that says that God loves you regardless. It pains him to have to admonish, to have to punish. That's not the default. The default is love.
Right.
And I think we've grown to the point that we, and maybe it's the heavy early Catholic thought process that drove it, and its tentacles are still intertwined in even Protestant thought, is that our default value is unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it causes a challenge there.
Yeah.
And I think we have the default backwards. I mentioned this on another episode. I think we have our defaults backwards. We have people that say we're default evil, and I go, that's not the story that's in the first book.
Right.
Our default is quite the opposite. Our default is amazing. And then, yeah, we can mess up our defaults. That I'll agree, but the default is not evil. Our default is good. The default creation was anything but evil.
Right.
Choices we have otherwise. So now we have a broken creation, and we have this, and we have God's points on this, right? It's interesting that you didn't have, for instance, in pre-flood, and we didn't have where God said, I'll find somebody to raise an army and crush all the bad guys. We didn't see that. We didn't say Noah and turn him into this great battle warrior or something. We don't see that. We do see him starting over again, and we do see him saying, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
He says, I don't want to do that again. So much so that I'm going to give you a promise. So it's so important that I'm going to leave a permanent marker so that when you see it, the world's changed. And I think the rainbow marker that they mention in there, it's interesting because, again, science will gab that for 15 seconds. that the topography and the climate on the planet is now changed. It's different. It's a different place. So now those are there. They were not there before. They are now. And that's that reminder that needs to be. He doesn't want that to happen again. So the default is back to, okay, now we're going to work through this. And his default is constantly going back to trying to draw you back to him. And so we expect that love from him. This is what we want. This is what we teach, right? That we want this love from him. But I'm not going to do it. Yeah. But yet we're created images of God, and I'll say, okay, so let's go Tanakh side, right? And say that's what their expectations were. If you're going through and loving your brother and you're the example to the nations that we should have been,
right,
this really becomes less and less of an issue. And then God gets to then work through that. Behaviors as it is goes the way it goes. We get to Jesus's time frame, and he says, hey, this needs to stop. We need to... Okay. And he says, we're going to do this. And I'll agree. It is radical because it's not what we would want to do. It's not. We don't want to do that. And I get it, but we go, well, I don't want, but people take advantage of us and da-da-da. And I loved how they put it, that I can actually impose my humanity by turning the other cheek, going the extra mile. I'm not doing nothing. I'm actually doing something. I'm actually bringing God's reputation into the event. I am. I'm actually bringing God's reputation into the event. We don't see it that way. We prefer active rebellion. We want to, and you're right, that it's personal. So it starts on your level and then let it go from there. So you're right. What we can't, it's not a corporate thing yet. Okay, yet.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's not expecting it there. He's not expecting it as that they're going to have to do this in small batches. His expectation is small batches. The land is not. He's not tossing Rome on its ear. And Rome is just one thing. I think it's kind of funny. We kind of forget that there's a whole rest of the planet floating around. We're just addressing Rome because Rome happens to occupy this particular piece of real estate. Yeah, it's where he was at the time. So Rome becomes the deal. I'm not convinced that some of the other nations around them that are outside of that realm were any more friendly. But what he expects us to do, and then we're going to need to get called out for it. It's fair. If we're willing to say what we're broaching here, then we basically put us on call to say, hey, I'm going to call you on that. If not, and it's true. So today, we've mentioned the date, so you've got a date marker, people. And so it's fair to ask this question, at least from us, from this point forward. Yeah. I'm for sure not going to tell you that I thought this my last 60 years. Yeah, for sure. Because there was always that defensive scenario to it. But the more you start to embrace, the more you start to see, and the more you say, well, the infamous, I've said this before, what would Jesus do? That's all I could do is watch. All I got to do is look. We have the benefit of looking back. They are just watching it in the moment, at the time, right? They have no idea. Every single point, I've said this before too, ad nauseum, every single point that we see Jesus talk about, from the Beatitudes to everything else he walks through here and mentions, every single thing he deals with. Every single thing. It included the lust discussion when we get to the adulterous woman interaction, right? We see this played out in his life. And we look at that, we go, ooh, we love that Jesus story. But how do we handle it? Yeah.
But it's a little too close to home when we have to draw correlations to our own lives. There were two illustrations that came to mind, one the other day and one actually just now. You know me, I love movies, and The Princess Bride is probably one of my all-time favorite movies.
Love it.
Family movie as well. There's so many quotable lines in there.
Love
They're
it. Oh
amazing.
my gosh, yes.
At the very beginning, when Wesley is just a farm boy, and Buttercup is telling him, go fetch the water, go bring me some firewood, all these different servant things, and treating him like a servant. His constant response was, as you wish.
As you wish.
Never once resented, never once. Now, and then, of course, in the narration, he says, and what she began to realize was every time he said, as you wish, he was really saying, I love you. Now, that's a romantic thing that you see there. But what would that look like if my enemy kept telling me, do this, do that? And I'm like, absolutely. With pleasure.
Right.
I'm more than happy to do that for you. And every time I did that, I'm saying, I love you. I care about you, not the arm distance. I'll tolerate you. I'll allow you. This is no, I'm going to do for you.
Yeah.
What I would do for someone that I cared about, because I actually care about you.
Right.
And that's a radical way of treating somebody who's mistreating you. And this came up, the other illustration I thought of, I was watching an interview, and these two women were talking about, what a healthy household looks like with a husband and wife relationship. And the one woman said, what do you do when your husband isn't acting like the husband he should be? And he's treating you poorly. How do you deal with that? And this woman had the best response I think I've ever heard. And this was in the context of abuse.
Right.
A whole nother issue. But she said, in every man, there is a king and a fool. You speak the one you want to see.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, it hit me, because I remember my wife when I wasn't living the way I was supposed to. Yeah. And she was treating me like the husband I should be. And she was in a group of women, and they were saying, how do we support our husbands? And it was, I'm praying for my husband to see who he is in light of God's view of him. And so she started treating me that way.
Yeah.
That totally transformed the way I started acting. Yeah. And what if we started treating our enemies like the creation, as you were alluding to, they were meant to be? And it's funny, as you were talking, I kept thinking, okay, what about Jeremiah, who says the heart is, desperately wicked? And Paul, who said all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It's like, those are true statements.
Right.
But they're not full statements in reference to the fact that how we were created.
Right.
It's the realization that, and Paul did refer to it, we have fallen.
Yeah.
So to have fallen, you had to have been at a state to be able to fall.
Right.
So what is that original state? And how can we treat the people around us like the people God intended them to be? And that becomes the transformation process.
And that's what we see Jesus talking about. Every single thing he's talking about is to impute humanity onto them. When they're acting inhumane, you're going to impute humanity onto them.
Right. Right.
Now, I'll bite that we have problems with that with enemies, and it's probably because we have problems with it with our non-enemies.
Very true.
But that's that real tough. Get the log out of your own eye before you start. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll agree. We need to clean up ourselves first. And right now, we're not looking so hot. I'll agree. And from a corporate view, it's particularly messy. And then when we talked about this before, if we ask somebody to read the Bible, I prefer that you start in Genesis, but some people in a church anyway prefer you start in Matthew. So, okay. So we're at Matthew. We're early in Matthew, right? And so they start to read and they look and they see this and they don't see it in church. So then they ask questions and then they say, well, not here and not that. And we don't. And all of a sudden, all the excuses come out, all the traditions come out, all the theology comes out. And they're looking, they're going, well, that's no different than over there. So I'd rather do that. And I gotta shrug my shoulders. I have to almost agree, because you're right. Yes, Jeremiah says that we choose to come from that space, and Jeremiah, it happens to be talking to a nation that had so syncretized their religious beliefs to the culture that we're surrounded, that now it's so muddled that even their default thinking becomes messed up, right? Paul is cautionary in that tale because he's bringing those that need to shift and change. And he's talking to groups of people that are now going to bring some of that messiness back in, right? Meaning that some of those other God things start to get in the equation. Paul's terrified of this. Understand, they're all terrified of this because post-exile, the Jews shift to we're going to so build up walls to follow Torah that we're not going to do this. So that's why a lot of these have come up, because we don't want to make the same mistake. So you build up ways to not do something. And that's not a bad thought. It's not. The key is, Jesus brings it up. He said, but don't forget what it originally says. This is part of the point. You're come up and saying that your idea,
right?
Do it. But don't impose that on somebody else.
Yeah.
But God is still going to hold both sides accountable. But in that, when God also says, because it says in Leviticus, love your neighbor, right? When he asks that question, that's a tough enough question to answer. Well, maybe I didn't do that. And in this sermon, it starts with that.
Yeah.
He starts with that. And then we get to here, right? He started with this, so you're already supposed to be doing that. And then you roll down this slope and you get to your enemies and you're like, I don't want to see this. And then we see exactly what plays out. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than when he says, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand what they're doing. Forgive them. And we today would say, excuse me. That's the point where, like, the adversary, when he's having this chat with Jesus in the wilderness, and he says, hey, call them down. They won't let you fall. They will do. Can you picture? Interesting picture, because what everybody has their visions of heavenly type stuff. So I'm not a wings and white robes guy by far.
Right.
But picture the host, heavenly realm host, having to watch the crucifixion until worse that the humans that are supposed to follow him, have run away to where you have a few women sitting at the base. The rest have all bailed. And the host up there that have got to be fuming.
Yeah. And
are wanting to go do something. Right? God says, that's not the way I operate.
Right.
It's interesting because then you think, well, I don't know what they think. And I don't. I don't know what a heavenly realm being thinks, to be fair. But you would think, at least from our little pea brain perspective, that there would be something to do that. And God said, no, this has to happen, right? And he's the example. That's why God gives him he says, all authority is now given to me. Now God says, boof, it's yours. You have shown me the ultimate and the example of obedience, of submission. All of it. So now it's all yours. The keys to the kingdom are now yours. But it came with that behavior. Well, if you want to be in the keys to the kingdom, it kind of causes you to pause. And it goes back to the Beatitudes, goes back to peacemakers, goes back to peacemaking. You kind of, like you're saying, it's kind of the default is there has to be conflict to have peacemaking. So, when people say that Torah was meant to be done perfectly, I said, there's a problem because already inside of Torah has, when this doesn't go right,
exactly.
What are you supposed to do, right? It's built in. Yeah. The flaw is built into the deal. The same thing. Peacemaker says there's an expectation of that. It's how do you handle it, right? Because if you're all acting perfectly, then the peacemaker is a null role.
It's a non-issue. Yeah.
Instead, he calls them sons of God. So there's something to ponder through that. Yeah. We just, again, it's not off the pulpit conversation.
Right. And I think the expectation on Jesus' part is what we tend to do is we look at the most extreme example and the hardest one and think, I can't do that, therefore I can't do anything. Yeah. It's like, start small. Even when he says, love your neighbor, later on he talks about who is my neighbor, and what that means. But it starts with who are the people right next to you. And for Israel, when they got that command back in Leviticus, they lived in a land where everybody surrounding them, and even at the time of Jesus, everybody surrounding them was not friendlies. They were enemies. Yeah. We know the Middle East well enough to know they are in the middle of this whole thing. So Jesus is like, neighbor, okay, my neighbor is this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, all the way around. And that guy's this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, that guy's. And all of a sudden you're going to get to an outer edge where that person next to you is not your friendly. That's the other side, the enemy. And how do you treat them? But he's already given you an opportunity to learn what that's like to love the people closest to you. Now start looking at that outside. And what does that look like? Yeah. And he's not expecting this, like you said, perfection. He's expecting us to just start with where we're at and work our way out.
Yeah.
And that's doable.
Yeah. Integrity is a word that I've come to embrace over this time frame. This perfection is acting with integrity and purpose. Okay. Mm-hmm. And if you throw that to God, if you're throwing that, be perfect as your Father's perfect, that phrase they'd like to use, I'd say change the word. And it's not like I'm asking for a word out of the sky. Take a look at the word and the meanings and the other words are attached to it. And integrity fits the role. But integrity changes the picture for us in a mental picture piece, right? Mm-hmm. So now I'm not picturing this work of art or this ball, this thing that's flawless. I'm all of a sudden because integrity also implies action, where perfection, we're looking for a picture. We're looking for this thing that we can observe from the outside. Integrity is what I'm doing in the moment. Yeah? Right. So if I'm with integrity and purpose, and God is working with us with integrity and purpose, that he is the most consistent. So we need to say, okay, how do I get there?
Right.
And you're right. Start there. Wives in the Skip Mullen has guardian angel, and he talks about the Ezer Kenegdo role that the wives are, right? And in that's exactly your point, is that if bring out what you want to be, right, in that setup. And so in a psychiatric world, we'd call that positive reinforcement. Yeah. There was it was one of those, like those Scared Straight videos,
Yeah.
And they made the comment that they'd interviewed all these people in prison, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and found out that 70%, this was a staggering number to me, 70% were told as they were kids, you're worthless, you're going to end up in jail, those type of terminology. You're good for nothing, you're going to end up in jail. You're a troublemaker, you're going to end up in jail, da da da. And so if 70% of the people are walked to that role, doesn't mean everybody that said that to. The scary part, if it's 70% has, how many more have been told that? And that's a scary thought.
Yeah.
So, and none of that is Jesus talk.
No.
You're right. It's entirely the opposite. To where I'm entirely coming at you and saying, do this. When you're edifying your brother and you're talking to them and you're trying to deal with a splinter, right? I'm supposed to build you up in the move, not knock you down. It's not to push you below me. It's that we need to raise incoming tide raises all ships. If we have that mentality of raising and coming up together, you're right. There's more. The possibilities are endless.
Yep, absolutely.
Loving your enemy, going to be tough, but worthy to play. I would suggest to people, try it. It's like, Mikey, try it. He likes it. Hey, Mikey. Yeah. And boy, that dates us. And if you want to know about that, go to YouTube and look up Mikey and Life Cereal. And you'll enjoy that one. So loving your enemy. I mean, I would say let's start with your brother and get that right or work on that. And I think it will then be the example that we see, and we see Jesus. Again, don't wear the WWJD bracelet. Don't wear the bumper sticker. Don't put the bumper sticker on. Don't wear the hat if you're not going to do what he does. And these are part of things that he's talking about that he does. And I'm for it, but please be the example that he asks us to be, in that role. So thanks. Anything else?
Nope, that was good, cathartic, and it definitely challenging to go, okay, I got to apply that. And I can think of a couple of examples that I'm going to have to stretch myself a little bit, but it'll be good.
Well, and then try it and put God to the test. Yeah. I love that part. I don't have a problem with that. That we have to say, put God to the test. He's asked you to do it. Test him. Do it. I think when you do that and you impose the humanity that we are, because we are created as humans, I very much believe we're humans. So we impose that, and we impose that on others, that they're humans, loved by God, with all of his heart.
Yep.
That there's more to the table. So, okay, so this wraps up our Sermon on the Mount, episode 5. There's a lot, and there's more coming, mind you. But these are fun. So we have these discussions to cause discussion. We're not here tossing out answers and platitudes. We're here to say, now we've just put the discussion in your lap. We've now said it. Okay, now what's that line that Mike Myers is, what's his name on Saturday Night Live, where he goes, talk amongst yourselves. Talk amongst yourselves. So talk amongst yourselves. Think about it, because this is radically different than what you probably normally heard and talked about. So enjoy this evening. It's Friday night. Thanks for with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.